Tonight we're going somewhere dark. A harbour in Sicily, in October 1347. Ships have just arrived from the Black Sea, and the people on the dock are about to wish they hadn't looked. Picture it. The port of Messina, on the northeastern tip of Sicily, a busy place, a working place, the kind of harbour where merchants argue about tariffs and dock workers swap gossip, and the smell of fish and rope and salt is so familiar you stop noticing it. It's autumn. There's a chill coming off the water, and 12 Genos trading ships are coming in from the east. This should be ordinary. Ships come and go from Messina all the time. These ships have come from Kaffa, a trading post on the Crimean coast of the Black Sea, which connects Europe to the vast web of trade routes stretching east toward China and Central Asia. These ships carry goods, spices, silks, the expensive, beautiful, desired things that make the merchant world turn. The harbour officials walk down to meet them, and something is immediately, viscerally wrong. The smell reaches them before anything else. Not the smell of fish or salt or cargo. Something else. Something biological and terrible. Then they see the sailors. Most of them are dead, still in their positions on the deck, slumped against ropes, face down on the boards. The ones who are alive are barely so. They are covered in swellings, dark, oozing masses at their armpits and groins and necks, black and weeping with blood and pus. Their skin is mottled. Their eyes are glassy. They smell of something that living people should not smell of. The officials order the ships out of the harbour immediately. Get them gone. Get them away from us. The ships are expelled. They float, unloved and horrifying, from port to port around the Mediterranean, turned away everywhere they go, carrying their dying cargo. But it is already too late. It was already too late the moment those ships touched the dock. Whatever was on those ships is now in Messina. And from Messina, it will reach the rest of the world. Tonight, we're going to follow it. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here at the Still Hour, welcome. Genuinely, warmly welcome. This channel exists to give you something worth listening to as you drift off, history told slowly and carefully and with real affection for the people in it. If that sounds like your kind of thing, subscribing takes about 2 seconds and it genuinely helps this channel exist. And a huge thank you to everyone who has suggested topics. I read every single one of them, and the Black Death has been at the top of the request list for a while now, which says something interesting about all of you. One more thing, drop a comment tonight. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. I love knowing that someone in Oslo and someone in New Zealand and someone in a very specific house in Ohio are all hearing the same thing at the same time. It makes history feel like the communal thing it always was. Turn off the lights. Pull the blanket up. Let your body get heavy. And maybe, just for a moment, be quietly grateful that you live in a century with antibiotics. Because the people in tonight's story did not, and the difference that makes is almost impossible to overstate. We are going to spend the next hour or so in a world where a flea bite could kill you in 3 days, where the most advanced medical thinking on the continent was essentially wrong about everything, and where roughly a third of the entire population of Europe died within the space of a few years. You are separated from that world by about 7 centuries and a very small pill. Hold that thought somewhere warm, and come with me. But before we begin, I want you to sit with some questions. Not questions I'm going to answer right now. Just questions I want you to carry with you through tonight. What would you do if half the people you knew died in a single year? Not moved away, not lost touch with, died. Your neighbors, your colleagues, your family. Gone. What would that do to the way you understood the world? What would it do to your faith, or your sense of fairness, or your fundamental belief that the universe had any interest in your survival at all? How do you explain something like this to yourself when you have no germ theory, no microscopes, no understanding of bacteria? When the most advanced medical thinking in the world is working from texts written 1,000 years ago by people who had no idea what a microbe was? What story do you tell yourself about why this is happening? Did the survivors feel guilty? That's one I think about a lot. Survivor's guilt is something we understand now, we have language for it, we have therapy for it. But in the 14th century, if you walked through a field of dead people and came out the other side breathing, what did you do with that? Did you feel chosen, or cursed, or both? What do you do with all the empty houses? The untended fields? The children with no parents and the parents with no children and the villages where the priest is dead and the Lord is dead and the only people left are strangers to each other? And here's one that doesn't get asked enough. What happened after? What did the people who came after the Black Death build on the ruins it left behind? Because something happened in the centuries following this catastrophe, something strange and difficult and arguably brilliant. The world that came out the other side of the Black Death was not the world that went in. And in some ways, in some quietly extraordinary ways, it was a better world. How does that happen? How does something this terrible become a kind of terrible engine for change? And finally, the most personal question of all, if you had been there, if you had been a merchant in Florence in 1348, or a monk in a French monastery, or a peasant on an English field, would you have run? Would you have stayed? Would you have believed it was God's punishment? And if you had survived, would you have believed it was because of something you deserved? Keep those questions. We'll come back to them. Let me tell you about the world as it was just before everything changed. It is 1347. Europe's population is somewhere around 75 million people. And compared to what had come before, the chaos of the early medieval period, the violence, the collapse of Roman infrastructure, things are actually not bad. There are new towns. Trade is expanding. The Gothic cathedrals are going up across France and England and Germany, these extraordinary stone monuments to human ambition and faith, taking generations to build, pointing upward at a God that everyone, absolutely everyone, believed was real and present and watching. The Mongol Empire, which we'll come back to, has actually made overland trade safer and more efficient than it has been in centuries. Goods from China and Central Asia and Persia are flowing west. Ideas are flowing too. It is not a golden age, not by a long way, but it is a functional civilization with momentum, with growth, with ambition. There are clouds, though. The Little Ice Age has been making itself felt since the early 14th century, a gradual, grinding cooling of the climate that has disrupted harvests, caused famines, left populations a little weaker, a little more precarious than they might otherwise have been. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 killed millions. The feudal system is firmly in place, peasants tied to the land, nobles above them extracting rents and labor, the church above everyone interpreting the will of God and collecting its own very considerable revenue, and above the church, filling the dome of the sky, God himself, watching all of this and presumably approving. It is a world that believes it knows, more or less, how things work. It is a world with a framework, religious, social, economic, philosophical. A world with answers. And then, from the east, along the trade routes that connect Europe to Asia, something begins to move. The bacterium is called Yersinia pestis. It is named after Alexandre Yersin, the Swiss-French bacteriologist who identified it in 1894, 5.5 centuries after the events of tonight's story, which tells you something about the speed of human understanding versus the speed of human suffering. The bacterium itself is ancient. It has been infecting rodents in Central Asia for thousands of years, cycling quietly through the steppe populations of marmots and gerbils and rats and ground squirrels, keeping a low profile, doing its terrible work in the shadows of history. Nobody in 1347 knew any of this. Nobody knew what a bacterium was. The word wouldn't exist in anything like a modern sense for centuries. What they knew was that people were dying horribly and quickly, and that whatever was killing them seemed to travel. That was about the limit of their understanding. And honestly, given what they were working with, it's remarkable they figured out even that much. The plague almost certainly originated somewhere in Central Asia. The precise location is still debated by historians and geneticists, but the leading candidates are somewhere in the region of modern Kyrgyzstan or the area around Lake Issyk-Kul. Recent archaeological work, including the study of cemetery inscriptions from the late 1330s showing an unusual spike in deaths attributed to a mysterious pestilence, suggests the plague was moving through the region a full decade before it reached Europe. Think about that. For 10 years, somewhere in the vast, thinly connected interior of Asia, this thing was spreading. And nobody in Europe had any idea. How could they? Here is one of the great dark ironies of the medieval period. The very thing that allowed the Black Death to travel so efficiently was the thing that medieval Europeans had every reason to celebrate. The Mongol Empire. By the mid-13th century, the Mongols under Genghis Khan and his successors had created the largest contiguous land empire in human history, stretching from the Pacific coast of China to the edges of Eastern Europe. This was achieved through violence on a scale that still staggers historians. The Mongols were not gentle conquerors. But once the conquering was done, what the Mongol Empire created was something remarkable: a unified, relatively stable zone of trade and communication across the entire breadth of Eurasia. Merchants could travel from China to the Black Sea without crossing a hostile border. Goods could move. Ideas could move. People could move. And diseases could move. The Silk Road, which sounds romantic and sounds like something from a children's adventure book, was in reality a network of brutal, exhausting, dangerous trade routes crossing deserts and mountains and steppes. But in the Mongol period, it was more functional than it had ever been. Goods flowed. Rats followed the goods. Fleas followed the rats. And in the fleas, Yersinia pestis traveled west. Now, we need to talk about the Siege of Kaffa, because the Siege of Kaffa is one of those moments in history that sits at the crossroads of spectacular military creativity and absolute catastrophic accident, and I think about it more than is probably healthy. Kaffa, modern Feodosia, on the Crimean coast, was a Genos trading post, one of the crucial nodes in the network connecting European trade to the Silk Road. It was a prosperous, strategically vital place, and the Mongols of the Golden Horde, the western branch of the Mongol Empire, based in the region north of the Black Sea, had various political and commercial grievances with the Genos who operated it. In 1346, a Mongol army under the Khan Janibeg laid siege to the city. Medieval sieges were, as a rule, long, miserable, and incredibly unhealthy even for the besieging army. You camped outside city walls for weeks or months, drinking bad water, eating bad food, not washing, in close quarters with thousands of other soldiers. Diseases spread with extraordinary efficiency in siege camps. And in 1346, something particularly bad was spreading through the Mongol army outside Kaffa. The soldiers were dying, not from Genos arrows, but from plague. Black swellings. Fever. Rapid death. The siege began to fall apart. And this is the moment. This is the moment where human ingenuity meets biological catastrophe in a way that will echo for centuries. Janibeg's army, dying, facing defeat, did something that medieval military sources describe with a kind of matter-of-fact horror that I find more disturbing than if they'd been scandalized by it. They loaded their dead, the bodies of plague victims, swollen and reeking, onto catapults. And they flung them over the walls of Kaffa. This is the first documented instance of biological warfare in history. It was not, to be fair, well understood as biological warfare. They weren't thinking in terms of germ theory, because nobody was. But they knew, on some practical level, that the rotting bodies of plague victims were a weapon. They were not wrong. The Genos inside Kaffa threw the bodies into the sea as fast as they could. It wasn't fast enough. The plague was inside the walls. And when the Genos merchants finally concluded that staying in Kaffa was a death sentence, they got on their ships and sailed west. They stopped at Constantinople. The plague, or something very much like it, was already there. They kept sailing. They went to ports across the Mediterranean. They came to Messina, in Sicily, in October 1347, with most of their crew dead or dying on the decks. The harbour officials ordered them away. Too late. Already too late. There is something almost unbearably poignant about this. The Genos merchants on those ships were not villains. They were people trying to survive. They were fleeing something incomprehensible, doing what humans do when faced with death, moving, running, trying to get somewhere safer. They had no idea what they were carrying. They had no concept of contagion in the modern sense. They could not have known that they were the vector through which one of the worst disasters in human history would be delivered to Europe. That's what makes the Black Death so different from a battle, or a conquest, or a famine engineered by political mismanagement. Nobody chose this. Nobody wanted this. It arrived on the back of the very things that made medieval civilization work: trade, connection, movement, ambition. The same ships that brought silk and spices from the east brought Yersinia pestis. The same roads that carried merchants and pilgrims and ideas carried rats and fleas. You cannot have one without the other. That is the specific tragedy of it. And from Messina, from those 12 ships, from those dying sailors and the officials who got too close, it began. There's a particular quality to catastrophes that begin quietly. The people in Messina in October 1347 didn't know they were at the beginning of anything. They thought they had a problem in their harbour. They solved the problem, they expelled the ships, and they went home and they went to sleep. And the next morning, and the morning after that, they started getting sick. That's how it always works. The beginning of a catastrophe feels local. It feels manageable. It feels like something that can be contained. It never can. Let me tell you about fleas. I know. Not the romantic entry point into an explanation of one of history's great catastrophes. But fleas are, in a very real sense, the engine of the Black Death, and they deserve a moment of explanation. The black rat, Rattus rattus, a smaller and more agile relative of the larger common rat most of us picture when we hear the word, was everywhere in medieval Europe. Everywhere. In the grain stores and in the houses and in the ships and in the markets and in the walls of every building, from peasant cottages to royal palaces. Rats followed grain, and grain was the foundation of the medieval economy. Where humans went, grain went. Where grain went, rats went. Rats carry fleas. This is simply a fact of life in a world where there are rats, which medieval Europe absolutely was. The rat flea, Xenopsilla chiopis, feeds on the blood of its host rat. And when a rat is infected with Yersinia pestis, the bacteria multiply in the flea's gut in a particularly horrible way. They form a kind of blockage, a dense mass that prevents the flea from properly digesting blood. The flea gets hungrier and hungrier. It bites more often. And every time it bites, it regurgitates a tiny amount of infected material into the wound, because its digestive system is blocked and it's desperately trying to feed. When the infected rats start dying, which they do, because the plague kills rats too, just a little more slowly than it kills humans, the fleas abandon the cooling bodies and look for new hosts. And in a world where humans and animals lived in extraordinary proximity, finding a human host was not difficult. The flea bites you. You are now infected with Yersinia pestis. The bacteria travel through your lymphatic system to the nearest lymph node. And there they multiply, and the lymph node swells, and the swelling, the bubo, becomes the characteristic sign of what we call bubonic plague. The name comes from the Greek word for groin, bubon, because the groin was one of the most common sites for the swelling to appear, along with the armpits and the neck. The swellings could grow to the size of an egg or larger. They were hot to the touch. They turned dark, black or dark purple, as the tissue inside died and hemorrhaged. They oozed. Medieval accounts described the smell as extraordinary, which tells you something about what extraordinary meant in a world that was already quite comfortable with a range of organic smells that would make a modern person faint. Bubonic plague had a mortality rate, untreated, of somewhere between 30 and 60%. Terrible odds. Not certain death, but close enough to certain that the distinction probably felt academic when you were the one with the swellings. But bubonic plague was not the only form the disease took. There were two others, both worse. Septicemic plague occurred when the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly, bypassing the lymphatic system. The blood itself became infected. This form moved so fast that people could develop symptoms and die within hours, sometimes before the characteristic buboes even had time to form. People went to bed apparently healthy and were found dead in the morning. Contemporary accounts describe this happening repeatedly, and the sheer speed of it, the fact that death came without warning, without even the grim courtesy of a few days' symptoms, was one of the most psychologically devastating aspects of the epidemic. You could not prepare. You could not say goodbye. You could not even be sure someone was sick until they were dead. And then there was pneumonic plague. Pneumonic plague occurred when Yersinia pestis infected the lungs. This could happen as a secondary infection in someone who already had bubonic or septicemic plague, or, and this is the truly terrifying part, it could be transmitted through respiratory droplets. Coughing. Breathing near an infected person. The same airborne transmission route we became grimly familiar with in more recent history, but in a world with no masks, no ventilation systems, no concept whatsoever of airborne pathogens. The mortality rate of untreated pneumonic plague is, for practical purposes, 100%. And you could catch it by breathing the same air as someone who had it. Now, picture the cities. Medieval cities were not pleasant places by modern standards. I want to be careful here not to be condescending. The people who lived in them were not unaware that they smelled bad, and they did what they could with what they had. But what they had was not much. There was no indoor plumbing. There were no sews in the modern sense. There were open gutters that ran through the streets, and the contents of those gutters were a mixture of human waste, animal waste, food scraps, slaughterhouse runoff, and whatever else people tossed out their windows, which was everything. Pigs and goats wandered the streets of most medieval cities. Horses were everywhere. The butchers worked in the streets or in buildings right next to residential areas, and the offal went into the gutter. Medieval cities smelled of animal dung and human waste and rotten smoke and unwashed bodies and the particular sharp smell of tanneries and dyers and metalworkers all operating in close proximity to each other and to the people who lived there. The Thames in London, the Seine in Paris, the Arno in Florence, all of them were essentially open sores. And the grain stores were full of rats. If you wanted to design a perfect environment for the transmission of bubonic plague, dense population, abundant rat population, poor sanitation, no understanding of disease transmission, no antibiotics, no public health infrastructure, you would design a medieval city. Every element was in place. Every condition was met. And the understanding that people brought to this situation was, through absolutely no fault of their own, completely inadequate to explain what was happening. The dominant medical theory of the medieval period was rooted in ancient Greek medicine, specifically in the work of Galen and Hippocrates, mediated through Arab scholars like Avicenna, whose texts had become the foundation of European medical education. The basic framework was humoral theory. The body contained four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and health was a matter of keeping them in balance. Disease resulted from imbalance. Treatment involved trying to restore balance through diet, purging, bloodletting, and the adjustment of lifestyle. None of this is remotely capable of addressing a bacterial infection spread by flea bites. But it was not stupid. It was the best synthesis of available evidence that centuries of careful observation had produced. The problem was not the intelligence of medieval physicians. The problem was that they were missing a fundamental piece of the puzzle that wouldn't be discovered for another 500 years. The other dominant explanatory framework was miasma theory, the idea that disease was caused by bad air, specifically the foul-smelling vapors that arose from rotting material, swamps, contaminated water. There was a logic to this. Certain smells did seem to correlate with disease, because certain smells did correlate with the conditions that bred disease, even if the smell itself was not the cause. Medieval physicians were not wrong to notice that people who lived near open sores got sick more often. They were just wrong about why. Miasma theory led to a particular set of responses to the plague that were, from a modern perspective, somewhere between useless and actively counterproductive. People burned aromatic woods, juniper, rosemary. They carried pomanders stuffed with sweet-smelling herbs. They avoided cold air and believed that warmth and strong smells would protect them. The plague doctors in their extraordinary beaked masks, those strange, crow-like figures that have become an iconic image of the period, packed the beaks of their masks with aromatic herbs and flowers, believing this would filter the bad air before it reached their lungs. It did not protect them. But it tells you something about how people think in a crisis. They reach for an explanation, any explanation that makes sense within their existing framework, and they act on it. This is not stupidity. This is humanity. They were trying. Under unimaginable pressure, with loved ones dying around them, with no good tools and no good information, they were trying their hardest to understand and to help. We should remember that before we feel too superior, living as we do in a world that has had its own recent experience of a pandemic and watching how even a society with the internet and peer-reviewed science and functional hospitals managed to respond. Watch the map. I know you can't see a map right now, you're lying in the dark. But I want you to imagine one anyway. A map of Europe in 1347, all those familiar shapes, the Italian boot, the blob of France and Spain, the reach of England up towards Scotland, Scandinavia pointing north like a crooked finger. Now imagine that map in October 1347, perfectly ordinary. And then imagine a slow, relentless stain beginning to spread from a harbour in Sicily. Sicily, October 1347. That's where we start. From Messina, the plague moved quickly to the rest of Sicily, Catania, Palermo, the whole island. The Sicilians tried everything to stop it. They expelled the sick, they fled their cities, they tried to quarantine the infected. None of it was sufficient. The rats were already everywhere, and the fleas were already on the rats, and the rats didn't know they were supposed to stay in Messina. By January 1348, the plague was in mainland Italy. And in Italy, it found some of the densest, most economically complex, most interconnected urban populations in the world. Florence, Venice, Genoa. These were not quiet provincial backwaters. They were the commercial heart of medieval Europe, sophisticated city-states with populations in the tens of thousands, crammed into relatively small areas, connected to every major port in the Mediterranean. Venice responded with something that was, in retrospect, actually quite clever. The city's authorities began requiring arriving ships to anchor offshore for a period before their passengers and crew could disembark, to give time for any disease to manifest. This period was initially 30 days, a Trentino, and was later extended to 40 days, a Quarantino. That word, Quarantino, 40 days. That is where our word quarantine comes from. The Venetians invented it, more or less, in the desperate early months of the Black Death's arrival in Europe. It helped, somewhat. It did not stop the plague from reaching Venice. Florence is where we have our best record of what the plague actually looked like on the ground, because Florence had Giovanni Boccaccio. Boccaccio was a writer, a brilliant, observant, humane writer who survived the Florentine plague of 1348 and wrote about it in the introduction to his masterwork, the Decameron. The Decameron is a collection of stories told by a group of young Florentines who flee the city to a country villa to escape the plague and entertain each other with tales. But the introduction, the description of Florence in 1348, is not entertainment. It is testimony, and it is one of the most harrowing documents in the Western literary tradition. Boccaccio describes the characteristic swellings, the buboes, appearing first in the armpits and groin, growing to the size of an ordinary apple or egg. He describes them spreading across the body. He describes the speed of death, 3 days, sometimes less. He describes people dying alone, because even family members were afraid to sit with the sick. He describes the complete breakdown of the social fabric, the rituals of care and mourning that human communities had maintained through every previous disaster simply could not function at this scale. There weren't enough people well enough to tend the sick, not enough priests to administer last rites, not enough gravediggers to bury the dead. Bodies were piled in the streets. They were carried away in carts. They were buried in mass graves, enormous pits dug outside the city walls into which body after body was laid, dusted with a little earth, and covered with more bodies. He describes the breakdown of norms with a particular kind of exhausted clarity. Mothers abandoned children. Children abandoned parents. People who had been close friends refused to visit each other. The usual protocols of grief, the gathering of the community, the sitting with the body, the public mourning, collapsed under the sheer weight of numbers. Such was the cruelty of heaven, he wrote, and to a great extent of man, that between March and July of the year in question, it is reliably thought that over 100,000 human lives were extinguished within the walls of the city of Florence. Whether that number is precisely accurate is debated by historians. Florence's population at the time was probably somewhere between 80,000 and 110,000 people, and estimates of plague mortality in the city range from 40 to 60%. But what is not debated is the basic truth of what Boccaccio is describing. Florence lost, in a period of months, somewhere close to half its population. Maybe more. From Italy, the plague moved in multiple directions simultaneously, following the trade routes, because of course it did, because the same roads and sea lanes that had carried prosperity were now carrying death. France was hit in the first half of 1348. Marseilles, that great Mediterranean port, fell first. Then it moved inland and northward. By the middle of 1348, it had reached Paris. By the summer, it reached Avignon, and Avignon mattered in a particular way, because Avignon was where the Pope was. The papal court had been relocated to Avignon from Rome in 1309, and it was still there in 1348, which meant that Avignon was not just a city but the administrative and spiritual capital of the entire Western Church. Thousands of clergy, petitioners, administrators, and courtiers were crowded into this relatively compact city in the south of France. The plague found them. Pope Clement VI, who was old but not stupid, tried to protect himself by staying in his chambers between two enormous fires that burned constantly, apparently on the advice of his physician that the heat would kill the bad air. He survived. Many around him did not. The streets of Avignon were, by contemporary accounts, so full of dead bodies that Clement VI was eventually obliged to consecrate the Rhône River itself as holy ground so that bodies could be thrown into it. Think about that. The river as a mass grave, blessed by the head of the church because there was no other option. England fell in the autumn of 1348. The plague came by ship, almost certainly from Gascony in southwestern France, though there are multiple candidate arrival points. Melcombe Regis, in Dorset on the south coast of England, is the traditional first landing point, with the plague arriving sometime in late June or July 1348. From there it moved with terrible efficiency northward, following the road networks and the rivers and the trading connections of medieval England. London was hit in the autumn of 1348. The city's population at the time was perhaps 80,000 people, crammed into the square mile of the old Roman walls and the sprawling, crowded suburbs beyond. By the time the plague receded in 1349, London had perhaps lost somewhere between a third and a half of its people. The east side of the old churchyard at Smithfield, expanded into an emergency burial ground, received thousands of bodies. When construction workers in the early 21st century dug into that site in preparation for the new Crossrail line, they found the mass graves, the bodies still there after 7 centuries, some showing the characteristic signs of plague. Scandinavia fell in 1349. Norway's plague arrived by ship from England, a particularly grim symmetry, England passing on to its northern neighbors what France had passed to it. The story of Askøy, a small island off the coast of Norway, is typical and terrible. A ship arrives, the crew dead or dying, and within weeks the communities on the island are devastated. The Norse word for plague, manfall, meaning the fall of men, gives you a sense of how it was perceived. Eastward, into Poland, into Russia, across the Byzantine Empire. Russia was not spared, though it seems to have been hit somewhat later, 1351 or so, and perhaps slightly less severely in some regions, though the historical record here is patchier. By the time it finally began to recede, the plague had moved across the entire continent, from the shores of the Mediterranean to the coast of Norway, from the Atlantic edge of Ireland to the steppes of Russia. The numbers. We have to talk about the numbers, even though the numbers are inadequate, even though no number can really carry the weight of what happened. The pre-plague population of Europe was approximately 75 million people. The death toll of the Black Death is generally estimated at somewhere between 30 and 60% of that population, depending on the region, the time period, the quality of the historical evidence. The most commonly cited figure is roughly a third of the European population. Some historians go higher. Some regions saw far greater losses. That means, at a conservative estimate, somewhere between 20 and 30 million people died. In a period of roughly 4 to 5 years. In a world without hospitals in the modern sense, without public health infrastructure, without any mechanism for coordinated response. To put that in a contemporary frame, imagine the population of the United States dropping by a third in 4 years. Imagine that every third person you can think of, in your family, in your workplace, on your street, is gone. Not moved away. Dead. Imagine that happening simultaneously in every country on Earth. That is the Black Death. I want to step back from the statistics for a moment, because statistics are how we protect ourselves from things that are too large to feel. And I think we should try to feel this. A mother. She is 32 years old, which in the 14th century is middle-aged, effectively, though she does not think of it that way because nobody does. She lives in Florence, or Paris, or a small English market town in Wiltshire, it doesn't matter which. She has 3 children. She noticed the swelling under her arm 2 days ago. This morning she woke up with a fever so high that the world seems to be happening behind a layer of gauze. The swelling is larger. It is the color of an old bruise and it is warm to the touch, and when she presses it, carefully, just with one finger, the pain is so sharp and vivid that she has to put her fist in her mouth to keep from crying out, because she doesn't want to frighten the children. She knows what it is. Everyone knows what it is. There is nothing else it could be, not this year, not in this city. Her husband died 3 weeks ago. He went quickly, the septicemic form, the one that leaves no time. He complained of a headache in the evening and was dead before sunrise, and the skin on his hands and face had darkened in those last hours in a way she is trying not to think about. She sat with him. She held his hand. She probably shouldn't have. There is a priest, maybe, if one can be found, many of them are dead already. There is a neighbor, perhaps, though the neighbors on this street are afraid to knock on a door where the sickness has been. There are the children, who are old enough to understand that something is very wrong and young enough to need someone to pretend otherwise. This is what the Black Death felt like. Not the grand sweep of continental tragedy. This. One woman. One fever. 3 children standing in a doorway watching their mother try to decide what to do, and here is the thing that nobody tells you about the Black Death. The part that gets left out of the horror. What came next? Because we spend so much time, and rightly so, dwelling on the dying, that we rarely stop to ask what happened to the living. What it looked like the morning after. What the world felt like when the worst was over and people stepped outside and tried to figure out how to be human again in a landscape that had been hollowed out almost beyond recognition. What the survivors did with the silence. Let's start with the numbers, because the numbers matter, even though they are almost too large to hold in your mind at once. Between 1347 and 1353, somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's entire population died. The range is wide because record-keeping in the 14th century was inconsistent, because records themselves were sometimes destroyed, because in some places there was nobody left to keep records at all. But even the conservative estimate, 30%, means that roughly 1 in every 3 people you knew was dead within the space of 6 years. And in many places it was worse than that. Florence lost perhaps 60% of its people. Some villages in France and England lost everyone. Not most of their population. Everyone. The priest. The miller. The blacksmith. The children. The dogs. Think about that for a moment. There were places in Europe where you could walk through the entire village and find nobody. Not a single living person. Just the buildings, still standing, and the fields beyond them, and a silence so complete it had a texture to it. That silence is one of the things the chroniclers keep coming back to. Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through the plague in Florence and wrote about it in the introduction to the Decameron, describes walking through streets that had been, just months before, among the most vibrant and crowded in Europe. He writes about the absence of sound. The absence of the particular human noise, the arguing, the hawking of wares, the children, the cartwheels on cobblestones, that you only notice when it's gone. 14th century Florence was not a quiet city. It was one of the great commercial centers of the medieval world, full of merchants and bankers and artists and laborers. And then it went quiet. The fields were the most visible sign of what had happened. Medieval farming was labor-intensive in a way that is almost impossible to imagine now. Every step of the process, plowing, planting, tending, harvesting, threshing, required hands. A shortage of hands meant a shortage of food, and so in the years after the initial wave of plague, harvests rotted in the fields because there was no one to bring them in. You would walk out from a town and see wheat standing unharvested, turning brown, bending over, and eventually flattening into the mud. Orchards with fruit that nobody picked. Kitchen gardens gone to weed. Livestock wandering without fences to contain them because the people who had maintained the fences were dead. The wandering livestock is one of those details that keeps appearing in accounts from this period, and it lodges in your mind in a way that the larger statistics don't. Pigs and sheep and cattle moving across the landscape without direction, grazing in places they'd never been allowed, sometimes found miles from where they'd started. The social order that had kept them penned and managed had dissolved. They were just animals in a landscape now. Inside the houses it was stranger still. One of the particularities of the plague was how quickly it killed, which meant that ordinary life was interrupted rather than concluded. There are accounts of half-eaten meals found in abandoned houses. Unfinished letters on tables, the ink dried on the quill, the letter ending mid-sentence, the person who had been writing it simply gone before the thought was complete. Clothing laid out for the morning that nobody came back to wear. Bread started but never baked. These are the small, unbearable details of sudden death, not the grand farewell but the ordinary thing left undone. Children were everywhere in the aftermath, and not in the way you want children to be everywhere. A wave of orphaned children swept through Europe in the years after the plague, children whose parents had died, sometimes both parents simultaneously, sometimes leaving behind a household of children with no adult at all. The mechanisms for caring for orphan children in medieval Europe were not robust at the best of times, and these were not the best of times. Churches and monasteries took in what they could. Extended family absorbed others, when extended family existed. Many children simply fell through whatever fragile net existed and survived as best they could, which sometimes meant not surviving at all. There is a particular grief in all of this that is hard to articulate but that the sources keep reaching for. It was not just that people died. It was that the dying was so fast and so total that the ordinary rituals of death, the farewell, the last rites, the preparation of the body, the funeral, the mourning, collapsed entirely under the weight of numbers. People died without last rites, which for a deeply Catholic society was a profound spiritual terror on top of everything else. Bodies were buried in mass graves rather than individual plots, without markers, without prayers said over them specifically, without the individual acknowledgement that a life had been lived and had mattered. To be buried like that, unnamed in a pit with dozens of others, this violated something fundamental in the way medieval Europeans understood the relationship between the living and the dead. And then there was the smell. It persisted for months after the dying stopped. The smell of a city where thousands of bodies had been inadequately, hastily buried. The smell of rotting food in abandoned houses. The smell of livestock left too long without care. The smell of a world that had been overwhelmed and was still, slowly, decomposing into something new. And yet the people who were still alive got up in the morning, ate whatever there was to eat, found their way to neighbors and relatives, when neighbors and relatives still existed, began, slowly and without any particular plan, the work of figuring out what came next. And what came next is where this story gets genuinely, wonderfully, unexpectedly strange. Here is where I want you to really pay attention, because this is one of those moments in history where something happened that nobody planned and nobody predicted and nobody would have believed possible, and yet it happened anyway, because reality doesn't always wait for permission. Before the plague, the European peasant class had essentially no power. I want you to understand how complete this was, because it's easy to say they had no power and not quite grasp what that meant in practice. Under the feudal system, a peasant, specifically a serf, which is what most agricultural laborers were, was bound to the land. Not to the lord exactly, but to the land itself, which amounts to much the same thing since the lord owned the land. A serf could not leave without their lord's permission, could not marry without permission, could not pass their small plot of land to their children without paying fees to the lord. They owed the lord a certain number of days of labor per week on his land, in addition to farming their own small holding just enough to survive. They paid taxes in the form of goods, grain, livestock, whatever they had produced. In a bad year, after paying everything they owed, there was sometimes genuinely nothing left. Medieval peasants starved. Not occasionally. Regularly. The wages for the work they were allowed to do for pay, because some agricultural work was paid, on top of the obligatory unpaid labor, had been essentially frozen for generations. Lords set wages. Lords set the terms. If you didn't like it, there was nowhere to go, because leaving meant you were a runaway serf, and runaway serfs could be legally returned to their lords. The system was designed, at every level, to keep labor cheap and landowners powerful. And then the plague came and killed a third of Europe, and the entire thing collapsed overnight. Think about it from the Lord's perspective. You have lands. You need those lands farmed. Farming them requires people. And suddenly, and the word suddenly is accurate, this happened across Europe within the space of 2 or 3 years. There simply weren't enough people. Not enough to farm all the land. Not nearly enough. The amount of land stayed the same. The number of people who could work it had dropped by a third, or a half, or in some places more than that. For the first time in living memory, for the first time in centuries, really, the Lord needed the peasant more than the peasant needed the Lord. That sentence deserves a pause. The Lord needed the peasant more than the peasant needed the Lord. What happened next was something that no medieval peasant had ever experienced and that no medieval lord had ever anticipated having to offer: competition. Lords began competing with each other for laborers. They began offering wages above the traditional level. Then significantly above the traditional level. Then they began offering things that would have been unthinkable 5 years before: reduced obligations, freedom from certain fees, better terms on land tenancy. And peasants, who were not stupid and who were living for the first time in a world where their labor was genuinely valuable, began to negotiate. Some of them simply walked away. Just got up and left their traditional holdings and went somewhere that was paying more. Which was technically illegal. Which was, in theory, grounds for being rounded up and returned. Except that the people who would have done the rounding up had also died in substantial numbers, and more importantly, the lords who might have wanted them returned often couldn't actually afford to make enemies of neighboring lords by trying to retrieve their runaway peasants, because those neighboring lords were themselves desperate for labor and not particularly inclined to cooperate. The effect was a wage spiral that happened across Europe simultaneously and that nothing in the existing social order was equipped to stop. In England, the response from the government came in 1351, with something called the Statute of Labourers. It's worth spending a moment on this, because it is one of the most perfectly futile pieces of legislation in English history. The statute attempted to do the following: freeze wages at pre-plague levels. Order all able-bodied men and women under the age of 60 who were not already in employment to accept work at those pre-plague wages. Prohibit employers from offering more than the pre-plague rate. Prohibit workers from demanding more. In theory, this was the government of England saying to the new economic reality, "No thank you, we prefer the old one." In practice, it was rather like trying to hold back the tide with a very strongly worded letter. The statute was never effectively enforced, for the simple reason that enforcement required people, and people were scarce, and more than that, the lords and landowners who were supposed to be enforcing it on the ground were themselves violating it constantly because they had no choice. You could not leave your fields unfarmed. You could not let your harvests rot because you were holding out for workers willing to accept pre-plague wages. Nobody was willing. The workers knew perfectly well that their labor was scarce, and they weren't going to accept 1340s wages in a 1350s labor market. There's something almost comic about it, isn't there? The most powerful men in England, sitting in their parliament, legislating against the laws of supply and demand. Passing a statute that said wages shall not rise. Wages rose anyway. Of course they did. Supply and demand doesn't read statutes. But I want to be careful here, because there's something important to notice in this story beyond the simple economic mechanism. What was happening was not just that wages were going up. What was happening was that human beings who had spent generations being told they had no value, no leverage, no right to ask for more, were discovering that they did. That they always had, actually. The plague hadn't given them value. It had revealed value that had always been there, that the feudal system had simply been arranged to deny and suppress. And once people have discovered something like that about themselves, once they've experienced what it feels like to say to someone more powerful, "I need more than you're offering," and have that person agree, it's very hard to take that knowledge away from them. The peasants didn't plan any of this. They didn't organize. They didn't write manifestos or develop theories of labor relations or even, for the most part, think of themselves as participating in a historical transformation. They were just people who had survived a catastrophe and were trying to improve their lives in the ways that were newly available to them. They walked to places that were paying more. They asked for better terms. They noticed that asking worked. They asked again. And the world reorganized itself around their asking. There's a version of history that talks about the great movements and the great leaders and the great ideas, and that version isn't wrong exactly. But here is a different version, and I think it might be more profound. Sometimes the world changes not because anyone had a plan, but because enough ordinary people made enough ordinary decisions in the same direction at the same time, and the structure that had seemed permanent turned out, in fact, to be quite fragile. The feudal system had seemed like the permanent condition of human society in Europe. It had existed for centuries. It had the weight of God and law and tradition behind it. And then a disease arrived that had nothing to do with social structures at all, that didn't care about the feudal system in the slightest, and in the space of a generation the entire edifice began to come apart, not because anyone had pushed it, but because one of the assumptions holding it up had quietly ceased to be true. The year is 1381. 30 years have passed since the worst of the plague, and a generation has grown up that did not live through it personally but that has inherited its consequences. That generation is angrier than their parents had been. And that makes sense, if you think about it. Their parents had lived through a time so terrible that improvement, any improvement, felt like a miracle. Simply being alive was a gift. Wages going up felt like extraordinary good fortune. But the children of the plague survivors had grown up in a world where laborers were in demand, where wages were higher than they'd been before, where it was at least possible for a peasant to negotiate with a lord. That was normal to them. They had no memory of the old world. They had no baseline of pure powerlessness to measure the improvement against. What they had instead was an awareness that there was still a gap between what they had and what they felt they deserved. And they were not inclined to be patient about it. Several things converged in 1381 to light a fire that had been building for 3 decades. There had been expensive and unsuccessful military campaigns in France. The crown needed money. The solution the government arrived at was a poll tax, a flat tax levied on every person, regardless of wealth. It was the 3rd poll tax in 4 years. And unlike a tax on goods or on land, which at least had some rough correlation to how much a person could pay, a poll tax hit the poorest people just as hard as the richest. For a class of people who had spent 30 years slowly, painfully, partially improving their position, who had begun to understand their own value, this was not just an economic burden. It was an insult. It was the ruling class making clear, in financial terms, that it still did not consider their lives proportionally worth any more than the lives of lords. And so they marched on London. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 is extraordinary for a number of reasons, but one of the most striking is its scale and coordination. We're talking about tens of thousands of people converging on London from Kent, from Essex, from across the southeast of England. They burned tax records. They attacked the property of the nobility and of the church. They captured and executed the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord High Treasurer, the 2 men most closely associated with the hated tax. They occupied the Tower of London. The leaders of the revolt included a man named Wat Tyler and a priest named John Ball, and Ball's contribution to the story is one of those moments that deserves to be remembered and repeated. He preached a sermon at the start of the revolt that contained a line, a single couplet, that had been circulating in England for decades and that the revolt now gave a political home to. The line was this: "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" Think about what that's actually saying. Before class. Before lords and serfs and the hierarchy of the feudal system. Before all the inherited structures that said some people were noble and some people were bound to the land, there was just Adam digging in the earth and Eve spinning thread, and neither of them was anyone's lord. The entire elaborate structure of medieval English society, Ball was suggesting, was not the natural order. It was a human invention. And human inventions can be questioned. The young King Richard II, who was 14 years old, rode out to meet the rebels at Smithfield with extraordinary courage, or perhaps the recklessness of a child who doesn't yet understand that kings can die. He made promises. He would abolish serfdom. He would reduce rents. He would grant amnesty. The crowd, somewhat astonished to be face to face with their king and hearing these words from his own mouth, began to disperse. And then Wat Tyler was killed, under murky circumstances that may or may not have involved treachery, and the moment broke. The revolt was suppressed. The promises Richard had made were retracted with shameless speed. He reportedly said, as the crisis passed, that serfs you were and serfs you are, and serfs you shall remain. The leaders were captured and executed. John Ball was hanged, drawn, and quartered, which was the medieval English government's way of making a point with considerable emphasis, and yet the feudal system did not recover from the peasants' revolt. Not because the revolt succeeded, it didn't, not in the immediate sense, but because the revolt proved something that couldn't be unproved, that the old order was vulnerable, that ordinary people would resist it, that the ground had shifted. The lords had seen what happened when they pushed too far. They had seen tens of thousands of farmers and laborers march on London and burn their records and execute their colleagues. That image didn't disappear, the memory of what ordinary people were capable of when pushed to a certain point, that lived in the minds of the aristocracy for generations. In the century that followed the peasants' revolt, serfdom in Western Europe gradually ceased to exist as a meaningful legal institution. It didn't end in a single dramatic moment. It eroded. Lords found it increasingly impractical to try to bind peasants to land when those peasants had alternatives and were willing to take them. The legal apparatus that had enforced serfdom became harder and harder to use when the social reality it was supposed to reflect had already changed. By the middle of the 15th century, the system that had defined European rural life for 300 years was, in the West at least, effectively over. The plague killed millions. It also, indirectly, unmade a system of human bondage that had ground those millions into the earth for centuries. That's not a comfortable thought. It resists the kind of tidy moral framing we'd prefer, but it's true. There's a painting I want you to think about. It's from the 15th century, produced in the years when the full cultural impact of the plague was working its way through European thought and art. It's called the Danse Macabre, the Dance of Death, and it exists in dozens of versions across different countries and different media. What it shows is a procession. And in the procession, the living and the dead dance together. Not living and dead in the abstract. Living and dead in the very specific. A pope, a king, a bishop, a knight, a merchant, a lawyer, a doctor, a peasant, a baby. Every rank of society represented. And beside each of them, a skeleton. The skeleton is holding their hand. The skeleton is dancing with them. The skeleton doesn't care that one of them is a pope and one of them is a peasant. The skeleton treats them all exactly the same. This was a genuinely new way of thinking about death, and it's hard to overstate how new it was. Before the plague, death in European art and thought was, broadly speaking, individualized. You died because of what you did or didn't do, your sins, your righteousness, your relationship with God. Death was morally meaningful. The good died well and went to heaven. The wicked died badly and went somewhere worse. The plague complicated this with devastating simplicity by dying in ways that made no moral sense at all. The righteous died alongside the wicked. The priest died alongside the sinner. The charitable died alongside the cruel. Children, who in medieval theology were not capable of serious sin, died in enormous numbers. The entire framework of death as divine moral commentary collapsed under the weight of plague statistics. What replaced it, in the art and literature that emerged from the plague years, was something more democratic and more terrible: death as the great equalizer. Death as the thing that comes for everyone, regardless of what they've done or who they are. The skeleton in the dance of death doesn't check your moral record. It just holds out its hand. You can trace this shift in the literature as well. The plays and poems that dealt with death in the pre-plague period tend to frame it in terms of sin and salvation. The works that emerge from the plague years, and the decades after, begin to grapple with mortality as something more random, more indiscriminate, more philosophically unsettling. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, written in the immediate aftermath of the plague in Florence, is framed explicitly as a collection of stories told by survivors trying to make sense of what they've lived through. And the stories themselves are striking for how secular they are, how interested in human behavior rather than divine judgment, how willing to look at the world as it actually is rather than as the church said it should be. That's the second consequence, and it's the more far-reaching one. If prayer didn't stop the plague, and it didn't, and everyone could see that it didn't, Then what did prayer actually do? If the church couldn't explain why God had allowed this, and it couldn't, not in any way that satisfied the questions people were actually asking, then what was the church actually for? If the Pope died alongside the beggar, then what exactly did the Pope's particular proximity to God protect him from? These were not questions that medieval European thought was well equipped to handle, because medieval European thought was built around the assumption that the church had answers. That the church's framework for understanding the world was complete and correct and didn't require questioning. And then something happened that the framework couldn't accommodate. And people noticed. I want to be careful not to draw too straight a line here. The plague did not cause the Renaissance. The Renaissance was already stirring in Italy before the Black Death arrived, driven by the rediscovery of classical texts and the particular conditions of Italian city-state culture. And the intellectual revolution that the Renaissance represented took another century and a half to fully unfold after the plague years. But the plague cracked something open. The certainty that had held medieval European thought in place, the sense that the church had the answers, that the framework was complete, that the task of the scholar was to interpret received wisdom rather than to question it, that certainty had been shaken in a way that proved difficult to fully restore. New physicians, in the decades after the plague, began looking more carefully at bodies. Not because they had good tools, they didn't, not yet, and not because the church approved, because largely it didn't. But because the plague had made it unmistakably clear that the existing medical tradition, based largely on ancient Greek texts filtered through centuries of church interpretation, did not actually work. It couldn't explain what the plague was. It couldn't stop it. It couldn't treat it. Bleeding and prayers and wearing herbs around your neck and consulting the alignment of Saturn, none of it made any difference to whether you lived or died. That's a profoundly motivating failure if you're a doctor. It says, what you know is not enough. It says, look harder. New thinkers began asking questions that the church preferred unanswered. Not all at once and not openly. The Inquisition was very much still operational, and the consequences of asking the wrong questions too loudly were severe. But the questions began to be asked. Written down. Passed between people who trusted each other. Accumulated, quietly, in the intellectual atmosphere of a continent that had looked into the face of something terrible and found that its explanations weren't adequate. The Reformation, which would shake Europe apart in the 16th century, grew in part from exactly this kind of accumulated doubt. If the church couldn't protect you from the plague, if the saints couldn't intercede to stop it, if prayer was ineffective, then maybe the elaborate institutional machinery of the medieval church, the indulgences, the hierarchy, the absolute authority of Rome, was not what it claimed to be either. There is a direct line, winding and branching but real, between the ships arriving in Sicily in 1347 and Martin Luther nailing his theses to the door of the Wittenberg church in 1517. It's a line drawn not in ink but in doubt. In the particular kind of doubt that comes from watching an institution fail so completely at something so fundamental that you can never quite believe in it the same way again. Art changed. Medicine changed. Theology changed. Philosophy changed. And under all of it, driving all of it in ways that the people involved often couldn't name, was the memory of a catastrophe so vast and so inexplicable that the old ways of making sense of the world had simply stopped being sufficient. This is the chapter one find hardest to write, and I want to tell you why. The Black Death killed somewhere between 25 and 50 million people in Europe alone. In absolute terms, it may be the largest single demographic catastrophe in human history. The numbers are so large they lose meaning. So let me bring it back down to human scale for a moment. Think of a village of 100 people. A real village. You know everyone by name, you grew up alongside them, you know whose daughter just got married and whose son broke his leg and whose mother has been ill for the last month. Now imagine that 35 of them are dead in the space of a year. Imagine walking down the main street and knowing, as you pass each house, Which houses are empty now? Imagine that one of the empty houses is your parents'. Imagine that one of the empty houses has 3 small children still living in it who don't fully understand why the adults aren't coming back. That was the reality. Multiplied by thousands of villages. Multiplied by hundreds of towns and dozens of cities. Sustained across 6 years and then recurring, because the plague came back in 1361, and again in 1369, and again several times more across the following century. The first wave was the worst, but it was not the last. And yet I've spent the last 3 chapters telling you about the ways in which this catastrophe seeded something. About how the labor shortage gave peasants power they'd never had. About how the political upheaval cracked the feudal system. About how the intellectual disruption opened spaces for the Renaissance, for scientific inquiry, for the Reformation. All of it true. All of it real. I am not going to stand here, or, I suppose, sit here, since you're hopefully drifting off, and tell you that the deaths were worth it. That's not a calculation any human being has the right to make on behalf of 25 million people who didn't get to choose. It's not a transaction. It wasn't a bargain. The progress that came afterward was not a return on the investment of all those lives, because nobody invested those lives. They were taken. Violently, painfully, pointlessly, in terms of any immediate human meaning. But here is what I think is true, and what I think is worth sitting with as you drift off tonight. History is not a simple story. It is almost never a story in which the good things come from good causes and the bad things from bad ones. The modern world, the world you're lying in right now, in whatever warm and relatively safe place you found to sleep, is not the product of a series of choices made by people who were trying to build it. It is the accumulated consequence of everything that happened, including the terrible things. Maybe especially the terrible things. Because the terrible things are the ones that break structures that needed breaking. That reveal assumptions that needed examining. That force questions that needed to be asked. The end of feudalism was not inevitable. The Renaissance was not inevitable. The Reformation was not inevitable. The rights of workers, the idea of a middle class, the scientific revolution, none of it was inevitable. All of it was contingent on things that happened, and some of the most important things that happened were things that nobody chose and nobody wanted. The survivors of the Black Death did not sit down and plan the Renaissance. They were just people trying to survive, trying to eat, trying to figure out what the world was now that so much of the old world had been stripped away. They bargained for wages because they needed wages. They asked questions about God because the old answers had stopped working. They painted skeletons dancing with kings because that's what it felt like. They built things, slowly, imperfectly, often unconsciously, because building is what human beings do when the alternative is despair. And the things they built, brick by brick, generation by generation, in the long aftermath of the worst thing their world had ever seen, those things eventually became the foundation of everything that came after. There is something almost unbearably poignant about that, if you let yourself feel it. All those people who died without knowing what their deaths made possible. All those people who survived without knowing what their survival would eventually mean. All those half-finished letters and untended fields and wandering livestock, all of that grief and waste and silence, slowly, over centuries, composting into something that fed the future. Grief and time and human stubbornness. That's the formula. That's always the formula. I don't know how to make that comfortable. I'm not sure it should be comfortable. But I do think it's one of the most important things that history teaches, if you're willing to listen carefully enough to hear it, that the story isn't over when the worst thing happens. That the worst thing is sometimes, not always, not neatly, not without enormous cost, also the thing that makes certain kinds of progress possible. The survivors built something. They built it on grief. They built it on empty fields and the memory of too many funerals and the particular silence of depopulated towns. They built it imperfectly and incrementally and without any clear vision of what they were building. But they built it. And here we are. Go back with me now to a harbour in Sicily. The year is 1347. October. It's late in the afternoon, and the light on the water is the particular gold that October light has in the Mediterranean, warm but already carrying the first hint of winter in it. The harbour is busy in the ordinary way of harbours, the smell of salt water and fish and the particular smell of old rope and wood, the sounds of cargo being moved, men shouting to each other across the distance between ships and docks. And then the ships come in. 12 of them from the east. Geno's trading ships, returning from Kaffa on the Black Sea. The officials who come to meet them, there were always officials at the harbour, there was always paperwork and assessment of cargo and collection of dues, approach in the ordinary way of officials greeting ships. And then they see what they are looking at. The sailors on deck. The ones who are still standing. The ones who are not lying on the deck or slumped against the mast. The ones who are still standing are already showing the signs. The swellings at the neck and armpit. The blotches on the skin. The particular expression of a person who is still upright but who has already, in some significant sense, left. The officials ordered the ships out of the harbour. The tradition says they were driven away with torches, with fire, with shouts. Go back. Don't come here. Take what you're carrying away from us. But it was too late. It was already too late. You cannot stop a thing like this with torches once the thing has made landfall. The rats were already off the ships and into the dockside warehouses. The fleas were already in the warehouses and moving to new hosts. The future was already, quietly, running through the alleys of the first Sicilian city while the officials on the dock were still shouting at the ships to leave. They couldn't know. The officials on that dock couldn't know what they were looking at. They knew it was something terrible, the state of the sailors made that clear enough. But they couldn't have known that what they were looking at was a thing that would kill a third of a continent. That would empty cities and silence towns and leave wandering livestock across the landscape of Europe for years to come. That would, in the long run, help unmake the feudal system and crack open the certainty of the medieval church and plant the seeds of a different world. They were just officials, doing their jobs, at the end of an ordinary October afternoon, suddenly confronted with something they had no framework for. Trying to push it back. Trying to keep it away. And here we are, 700 years later. In a world that those officials helped shape, without knowing it, without wanting it, without ever having any say in the matter at all. The world those ships carried forward into history. It made us. Not only us, we are made of 1,000 things, 1,000,000 contingencies, an incountable number of choices and accidents and catastrophes and recoveries. But this is one of the threads. This is one of the things woven into the fabric of the world you're lying in tonight. Now rest. The world kept going. It always does. And the people who come after the worst thing, the survivors, the children of survivors, the grandchildren of survivors, they don't just endure. They build. They ask questions. They plant fields again and paint pictures and argue about wages and march on capitals and fall in love and have children who grow up not knowing how bad it was and who are impatient with the old order in the way that only people who didn't live through the old order's worst can be. They build something new on the bones of the old world. Not despite what happened. Sometimes, strangely, impossibly, because of it. Sleep now. You're safe. The worst things that ever happened also, somehow, brought us here. And here, where you are, right now, warm and still and breathing quietly in the dark, here is not nothing. Here is everything that survived. Good night.